Sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we're not looking for them. A grandfather and his granddaughter visit a dog breeder, hoping to find a simple pet, but instead discover something that will change everything. 6-year-old Talina ignores all the playful puppies and walks straight to a pale-eyed creature hiding in the shadows. The breeder laughs and tells her she can have the quiet runt for free. But as soon as Talina touches the white pup, strange things begin to happen. Animals become calm around her. She starts having dreams about snow spirits and ancestors. Her grandfather Joseph realizes this isn't just any dog. It might be something from the old stories his people used to tell. As the seasons pass, Talina's bond with her companion grows stronger, and the community starts to remember traditions they thought were lost forever. But what happens when a child's gift awakens something ancient that was meant to stay hidden? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in Kivalina. Alaska carried the scent of snow, even in late spring. A reminder that winter was never truly gone from this remote village perched between the Chukchi Sea and the vast tundra. Joseph Crow Feather stood at his kitchen window, watching his granddaughter Talina play in the yard with the white pup they'd brought home 3 weeks ago. At 72, Joseph's weathered hands trembled slightly as he gripped his coffee mug, not from age, though his joints ached more each winter, but from something deeper. A recognition that stirred in his bones like an old song, half-remembered. The pup wasn't like other dogs. Joseph had raised sled dogs for 40 years before his retirement, and he knew their ways, as well as he knew the patterns of ice on the sea. This creature moved with purpose that seemed almost human, watching Talina with an intelligence that made Joseph's grandmother's stories echo in his mind. Stories of spirit guardians and children chosen by the ancestors. Joseph reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch no larger than his palm. His medicine pouch had been passed down through 4 generations of crow feather men, each adding their own sacred items to the collection. Inside were small pieces of carved bone, a fragment of meteorite his great-grandfather had found on the tundra, dried herbs that his grandmother had gathered decades ago, and a single white wolf tooth that had belonged to his own grandfather, a man who claimed he could speak to the spirits of the land. The weight of the pouch seemed heavier these days. Joseph had carried it faithfully for 50 years, but he'd let the old ways slip through his fingers like sand. He spoke English more than in Nupiaq now. He watched television instead of reading the signs in the sky. He'd raised his son David to succeed in the modern world, and David had done exactly that, moved to Anchorage, married a kind woman named Elena who worked for the state government, and built a life centered around careers and schedules rather than seasons and spirits. Talina was their only child, born 6 years ago during the darkest part of winter when the aurora borealis danced across the sky for 3 straight nights. Elena had insisted on a hospital birth in Anchorage, but Talina had arrived 2 weeks early during a visit to Kivalina. Old Sarah Kanguk, the village's traditional midwife, had been the one to catch the baby, and she'd whispered something to Joseph afterward that he'd tried to forget. This one carries the old light. The ancestors are stirring. Now, watching Talina communicate with the white pup in ways that seemed to transcend ordinary training, Joseph wondered if he'd been foolish to dismiss Sarah's words. The child had always been different. She could calm crying babies with a touch. Birds would land on her shoulders without fear. And her eyes, pale green like her mother's, but with depths that seemed to hold more understanding than any 6-year-old should possess. David and Elena were arriving this afternoon for their monthly visit. They'd been making these trips more frequently lately, worried about Talina's development. She was reading at a high school level, but showed little interest in the educational games they brought from the city. Instead, she preferred to sit with Joseph and listen to his stories about the old days, asking questions that revealed an uncanny understanding of traditional ways she'd never been formally taught. The white pup. Talina had named him Siku, which meant ice in Inupiaq, suddenly lifted his head and stared directly at Joseph through the kitchen window. Those pale blue eyes seemed to see straight through him, and for a moment Joseph felt the same chill he'd experienced as a child when his grandfather spoke of the spirit world. Siku's gaze held steady for several heartbeats before the pup returned his attention to Talina, who was now sitting cross-legged in the dirt, speaking to him in soft tones. Joseph couldn't make out her words from inside the house, but he could see Siku's response, the animal's complete focus, the way he tilted his head as if processing complex instructions, and the uncanny stillness that fell over the yard. Even the ravens that usually chattered from the power lines had gone quiet. The sound of a truck engine approaching made Joseph turn from the window. His neighbor, Tom Aknavigak, was pulling into the driveway, his weathered pickup loaded with supplies from the weekly trip to Kotzebue. Tom had been Joseph's closest friend for 30 years, a fellow veteran of the cultural shifts that had transformed their community from a traditional hunting village to a place caught between old and new ways. Joseph stepped outside to help unload groceries, grateful for the distraction from his growing unease about Talina and her companion. Tom emerged from the truck with his usual grunt of greeting, but his expression was more serious than usual. "Joseph, we need to talk," Tom said, glancing toward where Talina sat with Siku. "People in town are starting to say things." "What kind of things?" "Margie Kanguk was hunting ptarmigan yesterday up near Rabbit Creek. Said she saw your granddaughter walking with that white dog of hers, and every animal within a mile radius just stopped what they were doing and watched them pass. Caribou, foxes, even a brown bear, all just standing there like they were paying respects." Joseph felt his stomach tighten. "Margie's been known to exaggerate. Maybe, but she's not the only one. Billy Sheldon was checking his fishnets this morning and swears he saw Talina standing at the water's edge, talking to a family of seals. Says they were listening to her like she was giving them instructions." The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching Talina. She had arranged several small stones in a circle around herself and Siku, and both child and pup sat motionless within the pattern, as if in meditation. "There's more," Tom continued, his voice lower now. "Sarah Kanguk asked me to tell you she needs to speak with you. Says it's about the old prophecies." Joseph's medicine pouch seemed to grow warm against his chest. Sarah was Margie's grandmother and the closest thing their village had to a traditional spiritual leader. At 87, she was one of the few people left who remembered the stories from before the missionaries came. Before the government schools, before television and internet changed the way their people saw the world. "What prophecies?" Joseph asked, though part of him already knew, the ones about the bridge walker. The child who would come when the people had forgotten their connection to the land. Tom's weathered face was grave. "Sarah says Talina matches the old descriptions. Born during the dancing lights, marked by the spirits able to speak the language of all living things." Before Joseph could respond, Talina's clear voice called out from the yard. "Grandpa, Siku says David and Elena are coming now. The plane is flying over the mountains." Both men looked toward the southern sky, but saw only empty blue. The nearest airstrip was in Kotzebue, 40 miles away, and David always called when they landed to arrange ground transportation. Joseph checked his watch. Their flight wasn't due for another 2 hours. 20 minutes later, Joseph's satellite phone rang. David's voice crackled through the static. "Dad, we just landed early. Caught an earlier flight and got lucky with a charter to Kivalina. We'll be there in about 15 minutes. Joseph looked at Tom, who was staring at Talina with something approaching awe. The little girl had returned to playing with Siku, arranging the stones in more complex patterns while humming a tune that Joseph recognized but couldn't place. Something from his childhood, perhaps one of his grandmother's lullabies. "Tom, I think we're going to need to talk to Sarah sooner rather than later." His friend nodded grimly. "I'll arrange it." "But Joseph, if the old stories are true, if Talina really is what Sarah thinks she is, then everything's about to change. For her, for us, for the whole community." As if responding to their conversation, Siku lifted his head and looked directly at the two men again. This time, Joseph was certain he saw something almost human in those pale eyes, a wisdom and purpose that no ordinary dog should possess. The white pup held his gaze for a long moment, then turned back to Talina, who was now speaking softly in what sounded like fluent Inupiaq. Despite never having formal lessons in the language, Joseph touched his medicine pouch again, feeling the weight of generations pressing against his chest. His grandfather had told him stories about spirit guardians who came in animal forms to guide special children. His grandmother had spoken of times when the boundary between the physical and spirit worlds grew thin, allowing for communication between realms. He dismissed these tales as folklore, remnants of a simpler time when people needed such stories to explain the mysteries of the world. But watching his granddaughter now, seeing the way she moved within that circle of stones with the confidence of someone following ancient protocols she couldn't possibly know, Joseph began to understand that some mysteries were too profound for modern explanations. Some stories were more than folklore. They were memories of truths that had been temporarily forgotten, but never truly lost. The sound of another approaching vehicle announced David and Elena's arrival. Joseph straightened his shoulders, knowing that the conversation ahead would be difficult. His son and daughter-in-law were good people, but they lived in a world of schedules and logic, of scientific explanations and practical solutions. How could he begin to explain that their daughter might be something the old stories called a bridge walker, a child chosen by the spirits to restore balance between the ancient ways and the modern world? As David's rental car pulled into the yard, Talina stood and brushed the dirt from her clothes. Siku rose beside her, and for just a moment both child and pup seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light, as if they existed partially in this world and partially in another. Then the moment passed, and they were simply a little girl and her unusual pet, walking toward the house to greet their visitors. But Joseph's medicine pouch continued to radiate warmth against his chest, and he knew that whatever came next, the quiet life they'd all known in Kivalina, was about to be forever changed. The reunion dinner that evening started pleasantly enough. Elena had brought ingredients for Talina's favorite meal, salmon with wild rice and steamed vegetables, while David regaled them with stories from his work managing environmental impact studies for the state. Talina listened politely but seemed distracted, glancing frequently toward the window where Siku waited. Patiently on the porch, it was during dessert that everything changed. Talina suddenly stopped mid-bite of her grandmother's cloudberry cake and tilted her head, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Her pale green eyes grew distant, unfocused, and when she spoke, her voice carried a different cadence, older, more formal. "The ice spirits are calling," she said in perfect Inupiaq. "They say the balance is broken. The old agreements are forgotten." Elena dropped her fork with a clatter. "Talina, honey, what did you just say?" But Talina continued speaking in the ancient language, her small hands moving in gestures that seemed to accompany her words. Joseph felt his blood turn cold as he recognized not just the language, but the ceremonial speaking patterns his grandfather had used during traditional rituals, patterns that hadn't been practiced in their village for over 30 years. David leaned forward, concern creasing his features. "Dad, has she been learning in Inupiaq?" "She's never spoken it before." Joseph shook his head slowly. "No one's been teaching her. I haven't spoken it regularly in years myself." From the porch came a low, haunting sound. Siku was howling, but the notes were unlike any dog's call Joseph had ever heard. The sound seemed to resonate from deep within the earth itself, rising and falling in harmonies that made the windows vibrate. Other dogs throughout the village began answering, their voices joining in what sounded less like random barking and more like a coordinated chorus. Talina abruptly stopped speaking and blinked, as if waking from a trance. "Why is everyone staring at me?" she asked in English, her voice returning to its normal childish tone. Elena reached across the table and gently took her daughter's hand. "Sweetheart, you were speaking in a different language. Do you remember what you said?" Talina frowned, genuine confusion crossing her features. I don't remember." But I had the strangest feeling, like someone was whispering in my ear. She looked toward the window. Siku was trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't understand. As if summoned by his name, Siku appeared at the window, pressing his pale muzzle against the glass. His blue eyes were fixed on Talina with an intensity that made everyone at the table uncomfortable. There was something undeniably intelligent in that gaze, something that suggested the white pup understood far more than any ordinary animal should. "Maybe we should bring him inside," Talina suggested. "I think he's lonely." David exchanged glances with Elena before answering. "Dogs don't usually come inside during dinner, sweetheart. But Siku isn't like other dogs," Talina replied, with the matter-of-fact confidence that only children possess. "He's special." "Grandpa knows." All eyes turned to Joseph, who found himself caught between his family's expectation for rational explanation and his growing certainty that rational explanations were inadequate for what they were witnessing. The medicine pouch against his chest felt almost hot now, and he could swear he heard the faint whisper of voices, his ancestors perhaps, offering guidance he wasn't yet ready to accept before anyone could respond. A knock at the door interrupted the tense moment. Joseph opened it to find Sarah Kanguk standing on his porch, her ancient face grave with purpose. At 87, Sarah rarely left her home after dark, and never without good reason. "Joseph Crow Feather," she said in heavily accented English. "We must speak tonight. The spirits are restless, and the child's awakening has begun." Elena stood quickly, maternal instincts flaring. "I'm sorry, but who are you? And what do you mean about our daughter's awakening?" Sarah's sharp eyes took in the scene, the interrupted dinner, the family's worried expressions, and Talina sitting calmly at the table while Siku pressed against the window behind her. When the old woman's gaze met Talina's, something passed between them, a moment of recognition that made Talina smile for the first time that evening. "You're the dream lady," Talina said softly. "You've been in my dreams showing me the talking stick." Sarah nodded slowly. "And you, little one, have been in mine for many months. The ancestors speak of you often." David stepped protectively closer to his daughter. "With all due respect, ma'am, I think there's been some misunderstanding. Talina is just a regular 6-year-old girl, is she?" Sarah asked, her weathered hand reaching into a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She withdrew something that made Joseph gasp. A carved wooden staff, about 3 feet long, decorated with intricate symbols and small bones that rattled softly as she moved it. The talking stick was a ceremonial object he hadn't seen in decades, used by traditional spiritual leaders to focus energy during important rituals. But as Sarah held the staff near Talina, something extraordinary happened. The carved symbols began to emit a soft, warm light, barely visible in the electric lighting of the kitchen, but unmistakably present. The small bones chimed gently without any apparent breeze to move them, and Siku's howling outside shifted into what could only be described as a song of greeting. Talina reached toward the staff with obvious fascination. "It's beautiful, and it's singing to me." "Don't touch," Elena began, but stopped as the talking stick's glow intensified in response to Talina's proximity. Sarah looked at Joseph with eyes that held decades of accumulated wisdom. "The old prophecies speak of a bridge-walker, a child born when the dancing lights fill the sky, marked by the spirits, gifted with the ability to speak all languages of the earth. She comes when the people have forgotten their connection to the land, when the balance between worlds grows dangerous." "This is ridiculous," David said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're talking about folklore, not reality." "Am I?" Sarah asked. She held the talking stick higher, and its glow grew brighter. "Joseph, your granddaughter spoke in the ceremonial tongue tonight. Not modern Inupiaq, but the ancient formal language used only in the most sacred rituals. She used patterns that haven't been heard in this village since your grandfather's time. How do you explain this with your modern reality?" Joseph found himself unable to answer. The evidence was mounting beyond what rational thought could dismiss. "Talina's unusual connection with animals? her mysterious knowledge of languages and customs she'd never been taught. And now the talking stick's obvious response to her presence, all of it pointed to something far beyond ordinary experience. "What do you want from us?" Elena asked quietly, her protective embrace around Talina tightening. "Not want," Sarah corrected. "Need. The child's gifts are awakening whether we guide them or not. Without proper understanding, without connection to the traditional ways that give these abilities meaning and control, she could become lost between worlds. The spirit realm is already responding to her presence. Did you not hear the dogs singing in harmony? Did you not see how the wild animals gather when she walks among them?" As if to emphasize her point, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching filled the evening air. Through the window, they could see headlights as trucks and ATVs converged on Joseph's property. Word had spread through the village about the evening's strange events, the coordinated howling, the unusual animal behavior, and now Sarah's unprecedented nighttime visit to the crow feather home. "The community knows something significant is happening," Sarah continued. "They're looking for answers, for leadership. Some will welcome the return of the old ways. Others will fear what they don't understand. And still others," she glanced meaningfully toward the approaching vehicles, "will want to study your daughter like a curiosity rather than honor her as a gift." Talina had been listening to the adult conversation with the serious attention children, reserved for discussions they sense will affect them deeply. Now she spoke up, her voice small but clear. "I don't want to be studied. I just want to understand why I dream about snow spirits and why Siku knows things before they happen." The talking stick's glow pulsed gently as she spoke, and for a moment, everyone in the room could hear something impossible, the faint sound of distant drums, rhythmic and ceremonial, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Sarah nodded with satisfaction. "The ancestors approve. They're ready to guide her, but only if we're prepared to listen. Joseph, your grandfather trained you in the old ways before the modern world claimed your attention. The knowledge is still within you. The child will need that knowledge in the days to come." Through the window, they could see the first of the vehicles pulling into the yard. Tom Aknavigak climbed out of his truck, followed by several other community members whose expressions ranged from curious to concerned to openly skeptical. Word of the evening's events had clearly spread, and the village wanted answers. Joseph looked at his family, his son's worried face, his daughter-in-law's protective posture, and his granddaughter's calm acceptance of the extraordinary circumstances surrounding her, and made the decision that would change all their lives. "Sarah," he said quietly, "tell me what we need to do." The community meeting that night lasted until dawn. 23 adults crammed into Joseph's small living room, their voices rising and falling in heated debate about what they'd witnessed and what it meant for their village. Talina had fallen asleep in her father's arms during the third hour, but Siku remained alert by the window, his pale eyes tracking each speaker as if he understood every word. Tom Aknavigak spoke for the believers. "My grandmother used to tell stories about children like this. Said they came when the people needed reminding about who they really were." Margaret Sheldon countered with modern skepticism. "Children learn languages from television, from the internet. Just because we can't explain how doesn't mean it's supernatural." But it was young Billy Kanguk, Sarah's great-nephew, and one of the few villagers who'd pursued higher education before, returning home, who raised the questions that kept everyone awake. "Even if we could explain the language, how do we account for the animals? I've been documenting wildlife behavior around here for my graduate research, and what I've observed near this house defies everything I know about animal psychology." Sarah had remained quiet throughout most of the discussion, but now she stood with the support of her walking stick, commanding immediate attention. "You argue about explanations as if understanding diminishes mystery. The ancestors knew that some gifts exist beyond explanation, requiring faith and wisdom rather than proof and analysis." David, who had been holding the sleeping Talina, shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, Mrs. Kanguk, faith doesn't help us figure out what's best for a 6-year-old child who's apparently experiencing something none of us understand, doesn't it? Sarah reached into her bag and withdrew a rolled piece of what appeared to be traditional hide, yellowed with age and covered in symbols. This map has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandmother drew it during a vision quest in 1847. Marking the sacred sites around our territory, she unrolled the hide carefully, revealing an intricate hand-drawn map that showed not just the geographic features of their region, but also symbols marking locations of spiritual significance, places where the boundary between physical and spirit worlds grew thin, sites where traditional ceremonies had been performed for centuries. Yesterday morning, I found this tucked under my door. From the same bag, Sarah produced a second piece of hide, this one looking fresh and new, unrolled beside the ancient map. It revealed an identical drawing, same locations, same symbols, same intricate detail, but executed in what was clearly a child's hand. Elena leaned forward, recognition dawning on her face. Talina drew this when? I found it at dawn, which means it was left during the night. But according to you, your daughter was asleep in this house the entire time. Sarah's weathered finger traced the symbols on the new map. Every mark matches the original perfectly, including sites that aren't marked on any modern maps, places that exist only in our oldest oral traditions. Joseph examined both maps with growing amazement. His grandfather had taken him to some of these locations during his youth, remote spots on the tundra where ancient hunting camps had once stood, hidden valleys where traditional vision quests had been conducted, spiritual sites that had been deliberately forgotten when the missionaries arrived. She couldn't know these places, he murmured. Half of them haven't been visited in 50 years. Billy Kanguk leaned in for a closer look, his scientific training warring with the evidence before his eyes. The draftsmanship alone is remarkable for a 6-year-old, but the historical accuracy, this level of detail about traditional sites, requires knowledge that simply doesn't exist in accessible records. Because it was never meant to be recorded, Sarah replied. Sacred knowledge was passed orally from elder to child, and when the children stopped listening, the knowledge seemed to disappear. But it didn't disappear. It went back to the spirit world, waiting for someone who could bridge the gap between realms, as if responding to the mention of spirits. Siku suddenly stood and walked to the front door, pressing his nose against the wood while making a soft whining sound. Outside, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky, and with it came an unusual sound, the rhythmic beating of drums, faint but unmistakable. Tom opened the door, and they could all hear it clearly now. Somewhere in the village, someone was playing traditional drums in the old ceremonial patterns, the deep bass notes carrying across the morning air with unusual clarity. Who would be drumming at this hour? Margaret wondered aloud. Sarah smiled knowingly. Perhaps you should wake the child and ask her. Elena gently shook Talina awake, and the little girl opened her eyes immediately, fully alert despite having slept only a few hours. Is it time? She asked as if she'd been expecting to be awakened. Time for what, sweetheart? David asked. Talina listened to the distant drums for a moment, her expression growing peaceful. Time to visit the sacred places. The ancestors want to show me something important. She looked directly at Sarah. You have maps, Sarah nodded, holding up the child's drawing. Did you make this, little one? Talina examined the hide with curious eyes. I don't remember making it, but it looks familiar, like something from my dreams. She traced one of the symbols with her finger. This place, there's a circle of standing stones, and the ground gets warm even when snow covers everything else. Joseph felt his heart skip. The child was describing Aniu, the ancient ceremonial site his grandfather had shown him only once, warning him never to speak of it to outsiders. The site was unmarked on any official maps and could only be reached by following traditional navigation methods that read the landscape rather than relying on modern instruments. Grandpa, Talina continued, the dream lady is right. I need to learn about the old ways. Siku keeps trying to tell me things, but I only understand some of what he's saying." As if summoned by his name, Siku approached Talina and rested his head in her lap. The white pup's pale eyes fixed on Joseph with unmistakable intelligence, and for a moment the old man could swear he heard a voice that wasn't quite human. "The child is ready. The question is whether you are prepared to guide her." The drumming outside grew louder, more insistent, and now they could hear additional sounds, footsteps moving through the village in rhythm with the beats, as if people were being drawn from their homes by the ceremonial music. Tom looked out the window and whistled softly. "There are people walking toward the old dance ground. I can see at least a dozen families heading that way." Sarah stood with evident satisfaction. "The drums wake more than just the child. They wake memories that have been sleeping in all of us." She looked at Joseph directly. "Your grandfather taught you the old ways before the modern world claimed your attention. The knowledge is still within you, waiting to be remembered. But it must be used now, or it will be lost forever." Elena held Talina closer, maternal protectiveness warring with growing acceptance of the extraordinary circumstances. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" "What the ancestors require," Sarah replied simply. "Allow the child to learn her heritage. Let her visit the sacred places marked on these maps. Teach her the traditional ways that will help her understand and control her gifts. And prepare yourselves for the possibility that your daughter is meant for something far greater than an ordinary life." The drumming outside reached a crescendo, then suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, they could hear voices, the community gathering at the traditional dance ground, calling for Joseph and Talina to join them. Siku stood and walked to the door again, looking back at Talina expectantly. The white pup's message was clear. It was time to begin. Joseph touched his medicine pouch, feeling the weight of generations pressing against his chest. The moment of choice had arrived. He could either help his granddaughter understand her extraordinary gifts, or watch her struggle alone with forces beyond ordinary comprehension. "David, Elena," he said quietly, "I think we need to trust that some things in this world exist beyond our ability to explain them. And I think our daughter, your daughter, is one of those things." 3 weeks had passed since that pivotal dawn meeting, and Talina's education in the traditional ways had begun in earnest. Each morning, she and Joseph would sit in the backyard, while Sarah shared stories that hadn't been told aloud in decades. But it was during these sessions that something new and unsettling began to manifest, a necklace that appeared in Talina's dreams and somehow found its way into the physical world. The first bead had materialized on a Tuesday morning. Talina had awakened holding a small piece of carved ivory, no larger than her thumbnail, warm to the touch and decorated with symbols that matched those on the spirit map. She'd shown it to Joseph with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to extraordinary events. "The old grandmother in my dreams gave this to me," she'd explained. "She said it belonged to someone in our family who had the same gift as me." Joseph had examined the bead with growing amazement. The carving style was unmistakably traditional, and the ivory showed the yellowing that came with decades of age. But more disturbing was his recognition of the specific symbols. They matched markings on artifacts his own great-grandmother had worn, pieces that had been buried with her according to custom. By the end of the first week, Talina had collected 7 beads, each appearing after dreams filled with ancestral visions. Sarah had helped her string them on a piece of traditional sinew, creating a necklace that seemed to pulse with its own inner warmth. More troubling was what happened when Talina wore the complete piece. Her abilities grew stronger, affecting larger groups of animals and reaching across greater distances. The situation had attracted unwanted attention. Dr. Miranda Hayes, a child psychologist from Anchorage, had arrived in the village after receiving reports about unusual child behavior requiring professional assessment. David had reluctantly agreed to the evaluation, hoping that scientific analysis might provide rational explanations for what their family was experiencing. Dr. Hayes was a woman in her 40s, with the kind of professional confidence that came from years of dealing with childhood behavioral issues. She'd set up a temporary office in the village's community center and spent 2 days conducting standardized psychological tests on Talina, documenting everything with digital recording equipment and detailed notes. The child shows remarkable intelligence and emotional maturity, Dr. Hayes reported to the gathered family on the 3rd day. Her language skills are exceptionally advanced, and she demonstrates sophisticated understanding of complex concepts. However, I'm concerned about what appears to be an elaborate fantasy life involving communication with animals and spiritual entities. Joseph had listened patiently to the clinical analysis, but when Dr. Hayes suggested that Talina be removed from culturally reinforcing influences and placed in a more reality-based environment, he'd felt something snap inside him. "Doctor," he'd said quietly, "would you like to observe one of these fantasies firsthand?" That afternoon, Joseph had taken Dr. Hayes, along with David, Elena, and Sarah, to witness Talina's daily practice session. The little girl had worn her ancestor bead necklace and sat in the circle of stones she'd arranged in the backyard, with Siku resting beside her. What followed had challenged every assumption Dr. Hayes held about childhood psychology. Within minutes of Talina beginning her meditation, animals had started arriving. First came the village dogs, approaching the yard with unusual calm and arranging themselves in a large circle around Talina's smaller stone ring. Then came wilder creatures, Arctic foxes, several ravens, and even a young caribou that had wandered down from the hills. All of them sat peacefully, their attention focused on the small girl who spoke to them in soft tones that seemed to blend Inupiaq with sounds that weren't quite human. Language. Dr. Hayes had gone pale when a brown bear appeared at the edge of the yard. The massive creature had approached without aggression, stopping just outside the circle of assembled animals and settling onto its haunches like an enormous, patient dog. Siku had acknowledged the bear with a brief nod before returning his attention to Talina, who continued her strange vocalizations without showing any fear. "This is impossible," Dr. Hayes had whispered. "Wildlife doesn't behave this way around humans, especially not around children." But Sarah had smiled knowingly. "Impossible according to what you've been taught, perhaps. But the old stories speak of times when the boundary between human and animal consciousness grew thin, allowing for true communication between species." The session had continued for nearly an hour, with Talina appearing to conduct some form of dialogue with the assembled creatures. When she finally stood and spoke a single word in Inupiaq, Kwayanak, meaning thank you, the animals began dispersing in an orderly fashion, each species departing in the same direction from which it had arrived. Dr. Hayes had remained silent during the drive back to the community center, her scientific worldview clearly shaken by what she'd witnessed. That evening, she'd requested a private meeting with David and Elena. "I need to be honest with you," she'd said, her professional composure cracking slightly. "What I observed today doesn't fit within any established psychological framework. Your daughter demonstrates abilities that our current understanding of child development simply cannot explain." Elena had leaned forward anxiously. "So what does that mean for Talina?" "It means she needs guidance from people who understand what she's experiencing. And I'm not one of those people." Dr. Hayes had packed her equipment that same night and departed for Anchorage, but not before leaving behind a troubling warning. There are people in government agencies who study unexplained phenomena involving children. If reports about Talina reach the wrong departments, you might find yourselves dealing with investigators who are less interested in her well-being than in understanding how her abilities work. The warning had proven prophetic. Within days of Dr. Hayes' departure, Joseph had received a phone call from someone claiming to represent a federal research initiative interested in documenting traditional knowledge systems. The caller had been vague about specifics, but persistent about scheduling a visit to observe Talina's cultural education. Joseph had declined politely, but the calls had continued, each time with subtle implications. that cooperation was expected rather than requested. Sarah had listened to his concerns with growing alarm. "The outside world has learned of the child's gift," she'd warned. "There are those who would study her like a curiosity rather than honor her as a blessing. We must accelerate her training." It was during this period of growing external pressure that Talina's most dramatic breakthrough occurred. She'd been wearing the ancestor bead necklace during a morning session when she suddenly began speaking in multiple voices. Not different languages, but different personalities, as if channeling the spirits of family members who had passed on. Joseph had recognized his own grandmother's speech patterns in Talina's words, including specific phrases and vocal inflections he hadn't heard in 40 years. But more unsettling was when the child spoke in the voice of his great-great-grandmother, a woman who had died before Joseph was born, but whose mannerisms had been described to him in family stories. "The old agreements are breaking," Talina had said in her great-great-grandmother's formal speaking style. "The spirits of the land grow restless because the people have forgotten their responsibilities. The child must learn quickly before the balance tips too far toward chaos." Elena had been present for this session and had later pulled David aside with barely contained panic. "This isn't normal child development. Our daughter is channeling dead relatives. We need to consider whether we're in over our heads here." But it was Siku who had provided the most compelling argument for continuing Talina's training. During a particularly intense channeling session, the white pup had begun to change before their eyes, his coat becoming more silver than white, his build growing larger and more wolf-like, his pale eyes taking on an almost luminescent quality. Sarah had watched these transformations with satisfaction rather than alarm. The spirit guardian reveals more of his true nature as the child grows stronger. This is how it should be. Joseph's health had begun declining under the stress of the situation. The weight of responsibility for guiding Talina, combined with pressure from both worried family members and persistent government callers, had left him exhausted and increasingly short of breath. His medicine pouch seemed to grow heavier each day, as if the accumulated wisdom of generations was becoming too much for one man to carry. It was Tom Aknavigak who had finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "Joseph, the child's gifts are growing faster than our ability to guide them. And these government people aren't going to stop calling just because you ask nicely." Sarah had nodded gravely. "The time for gradual training has passed. The child must undergo the traditional trials that will fully awaken her gifts and teach her to control them. But such trials cannot be conducted here, with outsiders watching and the community divided." "What are you suggesting?" David had asked, though Joseph suspected he already knew the answer. "A vision quest," Sarah had replied simply, "to the sacred places marked on the spirit map, away from modern distractions and government interference. It's the only way to complete her training before forces beyond our control intervene." That evening, as Joseph sat watching Talina play with Siku in the yard, he'd made the most difficult decision of his life. The ancestor beads around his granddaughter's neck caught the last light of the setting sun, each carved piece seeming to pulse with its own inner fire. The white pup, now clearly more wolf than dog, sat beside her with the alert patience of a guardian preparing for a long journey. Joseph touched his medicine pouch one final time, feeling the weight of generations pressing against his chest. Tomorrow he would take his granddaughter into the wilderness, away from the safety of the known world, and trust that the old ways would be strong enough to guide them both through the trials ahead. The ancestor beads had given Talina the power to channel the wisdom of their people's past. Now it was time to discover whether that wisdom would be sufficient to navigate an uncertain future. The journey into the wilderness began before dawn on a Tuesday morning in early June, when the midnight sun provided nearly 20 hours of daylight, but temperatures still hovered near freezing. Joseph had loaded his old pickup truck with traditional camping gear, hide tents instead of modern nylon, dried fish and game meat rather than processed foods, and tools made from bone and stone rather than metal and plastic. Sarah had insisted on accompanying them, despite her 87 years and the obvious physical challenges the trip would present. "The child will need a woman's guidance for parts of the journey," she'd explained to David's concerns. "There are aspects of the traditional trials that only another female can properly oversee." Elena had wanted to come too, but Sarah had been firm in her refusal. Parents cannot guide their children through spiritual awakening without interfering. The old ways require that teachers come from outside the immediate family. To ensure objectivity and proper ritual observance, David had struggled with the decision to let Talina go, his protective instincts warring with growing acceptance that conventional parenting approaches were inadequate for their daughter's extraordinary circumstances. It was Talina herself who had ultimately convinced him. "Papa," she'd said the night before departure, wearing her ancestor bead necklace and speaking with the formal cadence that had become increasingly common when discussing spiritual matters. "The dreams show me what's coming. If I don't learn to control my gifts properly, they'll grow too strong for me to handle. I could hurt people without meaning to, or get lost between the worlds and never find my way back." The first sacred site on their journey was Sivulik, the first place, located 30 miles north of Kivalina in a hidden valley that could only be reached by following traditional navigation methods. Joseph had been there once as a teenager with his grandfather, but that had been over 50 years ago, and he wasn't entirely certain he could find it again, using only landscape memory. Siku, however, seemed to know exactly where they were going. The white pup, now clearly revealing more wolf characteristics with each passing day, had taken the lead as soon as they'd left the truck and begun hiking across the tundra. His pale eyes scanned the horizon with the confidence of someone following familiar trails, and he would occasionally pause to look back at the humans, as if ensuring they were keeping pace. The hiking was more difficult than Joseph had anticipated. His 72-year-old body protested every step across the uneven ground, and he found himself relying heavily on his walking stick, a piece of carved driftwood that had belonged to his grandfather. But it was during these moments of physical struggle that something unexpected began to happen. Wind chimes started appearing along their route. The first had materialized, hanging from a stunted willow tree near their lunch. "Stop!" Delicate pieces of carved bone suspended from sinew, creating haunting melodies when touched by the Arctic breeze. Joseph had never seen anything like it in 50 years of traveling these lands, and the craftsmanship was unmistakably traditional, showing the kind of skill that took decades to develop. "Did you make this?" he'd asked Sarah, but the old woman had shaken her head with evident amazement. "The ancestors prepare the way," she'd replied simply. "They want the child to know she's following the right path." By evening, they'd encountered 6 more wind chimes, each one appearing at crucial decision points along their route, marking turns in the trail, indicating safe river crossings, or highlighting areas where they should stop to rest. The bone pieces were carved with symbols that matched those on Talina's ancestor beads, and their ethereal music seemed to guide their steps, even when the landmarks, Joseph remembered, had changed with decades of weather and erosion. Talina had listened to each wind chime with fascination, often standing motionless beside them while their carved bones sang in the Arctic breeze. During these moments, her pale green eyes would grow distant, as if she were receiving instructions audible only to her. "They're telling me about the people who used to live here," she'd explained during one such encounter. "Families who followed the caribou herds and knew which berries were safe to eat and how to read the weather in the clouds." Sarah had nodded approvingly. "The wind chimes carry the voices of your ancestors. They're teaching you the knowledge you'll need to complete the traditional trials." Their first night's camp had been established in a sheltered grove beside a clear stream, with Siku maintaining a protective watch while the humans prepared their evening meal. Joseph had expected to struggle with the physical demands of sleeping outdoors, but instead found himself more rested than he'd been in weeks. The weight of his medicine pouch, which had been growing heavier with each passing day back in the village, now felt comfortable against his chest, as if the sacred items within were finally being used for their intended purpose. It was during this first night that Talina's most profound spiritual experience yet had occurred. She'd been sleeping peacefully in her traditional hide bedroll when she'd suddenly sat up and begun speaking in a voice that belonged to someone else entirely. "The child walks the old paths," she'd said in perfect ceremonial Inupiaq, her young voice carrying the gravitas of an elder. "The spirits of this place recognize her blood and welcome her return. But greater challenges await. The balance between worlds grows thin, and forces gather that would exploit her gifts for purposes." Contrary to the ancient agreements, Joseph had listened with growing unease as his granddaughter continued speaking, in the voice of what sounded like a tribal elder from generations past. The words were a warning about trials ahead, about the need for wisdom and courage in facing forces that would try to use Talina's abilities for their own ends. When she'd awakened the next morning, Talina had no memory of the nighttime communication, but she'd emerged from her bedroll wearing a new bead on her necklace. This one carved from what appeared to be meteoric stone and decorated with symbols none of them had seen before. Sarah had examined the new bead with evident reverence. This one carries protection against spiritual interference. The ancestors know what challenges lie ahead. Their second day of hiking had brought them to the edge of Sivulik Valley, where Joseph finally recognized landmarks from his youth. The hidden valley spread below them like a green sanctuary, protected from Arctic winds by surrounding hills and warmed by natural hot springs that created a microclimate unlike anywhere else in the region. But it was what they found in the valley that truly amazed them. Ancient stone circles dotted the landscape, traditional ceremonial sites that had been used for vision quests for countless generations. And at each circle, wind chimes hung from carefully placed posts, their bone pieces singing in harmonious chorus as the breeze moved through the valley. "Someone has prepared this place for us," Joseph had murmured in wonder. Sarah had smiled knowingly. "Not someone. The spirits themselves. They've been waiting for the child to return." As they'd made their way down into the valley, with Siku leading the way and the wind chimes providing ethereal accompaniment to their journey, Joseph had felt the weight of generations lifting from his shoulders. For the first time since Talina's gifts had begun manifesting, he'd sensed that they were moving toward answers rather than simply struggling with questions. The ancestor beads around his granddaughter's neck had caught the light of the midnight sun, each carved piece seeming to pulse with anticipation. Whatever trials awaited them in Sivulik Valley, they would face them with the wisdom of their ancestors and the guidance of the spirits themselves. The purification ceremonies began at dawn on their third day in Sivulik Valley. Sarah had selected a stone circle near the largest hot spring, where mineral-rich waters bubbled up from deep within the earth, creating pools of varying temperatures surrounded by smooth river stones worn flat by centuries of ceremonial use. Talina had approached the ritual with the serious attention of someone much older than her 6 years, removing her regular clothes and donning a traditional dress that Sarah had brought specifically for this purpose. The garment was made from soft caribou hide and decorated with beadwork that incorporated symbols matching those on her ancestor necklace. As she walked toward the ceremonial circle, the wind chimes throughout the valley began singing in unison, their haunting melodies providing accompaniment to the ancient ritual. But it was during the purification bath that the most remarkable discovery occurred. As Talina lowered herself into the mineral-rich waters of the sacred spring, something extraordinary happened. A crystal formation began emerging from the rocky bottom of the pool, rising like a natural sculpture responding to her presence. Joseph had never seen anything like it. The crystal appeared to be made of natural quartz, but its formation was unlike any geological process he understood. It grew upward in spiraling patterns that seemed to follow the same mathematical principles as the symbols on Talina's ancestor beads. creating a translucent sculpture about 3 feet tall that pulsed with its own inner light. Sarah had watched the crystal's emergence with evident satisfaction rather than surprise. "The crystal of seeing," she'd murmured. "The old stories speak of such formations appearing when a true bridge walker undergoes purification. It will allow her to see across time and communicate directly with the spirit world." As Talina had completed her ritual bath, the crystal had continued to grow and change, its internal structure shifting to create what appeared to be viewing chambers, spaces within the formation where images could be seen as if through windows. When the little girl had placed her hands on its surface, the crystal had responded with intensified light and the faint sound of distant voices speaking in ceremonial Inupiaq. "What do you see?" Sarah had asked gently. Talina had stared into the crystal's depths with fascination and growing understanding. "I see the old village, the way it was before the modern houses. People are gathering for ceremonies, and there's someone who looks like Grandpa, but younger." Learning from an elder who must be his grandfather, Joseph had felt his breath catch as he recognized the scene his granddaughter was describing. She was somehow viewing his own childhood, watching his education in the traditional ways, under his grandfather's guidance, events that had taken place decades before her birth. "The crystal shows her the connections between past and present," Sarah had explained. "She needs to understand how the old knowledge was preserved and passed down so she can properly receive what the ancestors want to teach her." Over the next several hours, Talina had remained in communion with the crystal of seeing, her pale green eyes reflecting its inner light as she observed scenes from their family's history. She'd witnessed traditional ceremonies, hunting expeditions, and spiritual gatherings that had taken place in Sivulik Valley over multiple generations, gaining understanding of cultural practices that had been gradually abandoned as their community adopted modern ways. But the crystal also showed her disturbing visions of the future. Joseph could see her expression grow troubled as she observed scenes he couldn't perceive, her small hands gripping the crystal's surface with increasing tension. "There are people coming," she'd finally said, her voice carrying the formal cadence that indicated spiritual communication. "Government people with uniforms and equipment. They want to study me like I'm a scientific curiosity rather than a person. And there are others, scientists who think they can measure spiritual gifts with machines and computers." Sarah had nodded grimly. "The outside world has learned of your awakening. There are those who would exploit your abilities for purposes that serve their interests rather than the good of the people." It was then that Siku had begun his most dramatic transformation yet. As Talina continued communing with the crystal, the white pup's physical form had started shifting in ways that went far beyond normal growth or maturation. His coat had taken on an almost luminescent silver color. His build had become larger and more powerful, and his pale eyes had begun glowing with their own inner light. But most remarkably, Siku had begun speaking, not in barks or howls, but in clear Inupiaq that all three humans could understand. "The child's awakening approaches completion," he'd said in a voice that carried the wisdom of ages. "But the final trials cannot be conducted here, where modern influences can interfere. We must travel to the place of greatest power, where the boundary between worlds is thinnest." Joseph had stared at the transformed creature with amazement. "You're not really a dog at all, are you?" "I am Siku, guardian spirit of the ice and snow, bound by ancient agreements to protect and guide the bridgewalker through her awakening," the wolf spirit had replied. "I have waited many years for her birth, preparing for the time when the balance between worlds would require her intervention." Sarah had listened to this revelation with evident satisfaction. "I knew from the beginning that the white pup was more than he appeared. The ancestors sent him to prepare the way for Talina's training. As the day had progressed, the crystal of seeing had shown them increasingly urgent visions of the challenges ahead. Government vehicles approaching Kivalina, scientists setting up monitoring equipment, and officials preparing documentation for Talina's removal to a research facility. where her abilities could be properly studied. "How much time do we have?" Joseph had asked. Talina had stared deeper into the crystal's depths before answering. 3 days before they reach the village. Maybe 4, if the weather delays their flights from anchorage. Siku had risen to his full height, now clearly more wolf than dog, his silver coat shimmering in the afternoon light. Then we must accelerate the trials. The final awakening cannot wait for convenient timing. That evening, as they'd prepared for the most challenging part of Talina's spiritual education, Joseph had reflected on the journey that had brought them to this remote valley. His granddaughter sat beside the crystal of seeing, its light playing across her face as she communed with ancestral spirits who were preparing her for trials that would determine not just her future, but potentially the future of their people's relationship with the spiritual world. The ancestor beads around her neck had grown warm, their carved surfaces seeming to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. The wind chimes throughout the valley had begun a more complex song, their bone pieces creating harmonies that seemed to carry messages of encouragement and warning. Tomorrow would bring the greatest test of Talina's developing abilities, and Joseph could only hope that the wisdom of their ancestors would be sufficient to guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The revelation came at midnight on their 4th day in Sivalik Valley, when the crystal of seeing began showing images that challenged everything Joseph thought he understood about their family's history and Talina's destiny. His granddaughter sat before the quartz formation, her pale green eyes reflecting its inner light as visions flickered through its translucent depths, like scenes from a movie only she could clearly see. "Grandpa," Talina said softly, her voice carrying the formal cadence that indicated spiritual communication. "The ancestors are showing me something about Siku that I don't understand." The wolf spirit, now revealed in his full supernatural form, approached the crystal with what appeared to be reluctance. His silver coat rippled with ethereal light, and his luminous blue eyes held an expression of ancient sadness. "What are you seeing, little one?" Sarah asked gently. "There's a collar," Talina replied, her small hands pressed against the crystal's surface, made of shadows and old metal wrapped around Siku's neck. "But it's not holding him like a leash. It's holding something back. Something powerful that he's supposed to protect, but also something he has to test." Joseph felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. "Test what?" Siku answered in his otherworldly voice. "Test whether the Bridgewalker is worthy of the power she's meant to inherit." The crystal's light intensified, and suddenly all 3 humans could see the visions Talina had been describing. In its depths, they watched scenes from centuries past, a time when their ancestors had made agreements with the spirit world, establishing protections that would maintain balance between the physical and supernatural realms. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As the visions continued, they showed Joseph's own role in events that had been set in motion decades before Talina's birth. He watched in amazement as the crystal revealed his grandfather's final ceremony, conducted in this very valley 53 years ago. In the vision, Joseph's grandfather knelt before a group of spirit elders, accepting a sacred responsibility that would affect generations of their family. He agreed to carry the medicine pouch containing artifacts that would guide and protect a future Bridgewalker, his great-granddaughter, who would be born when the dancing lights filled the sky and the world stood on the threshold of spiritual crisis. "I was chosen as her guardian before she was even born," Joseph whispered, understanding flooding through him. "My whole life, everything that led me here, it was all preparation for this moment." Sarah nodded with satisfaction. "The spirits work across generations, Joseph. Your grandfather knew that the old ways would be nearly forgotten by the time the Bridgewalker arrived. He prepared you to be ready, even if you didn't understand your purpose until now. But the crystal's revelations weren't finished. The visions shifted to show events that had been happening parallel to their own journey, government officials and scientists arriving in Kivalina, searching for Talina, and growing increasingly frustrated by her absence. But these weren't random bureaucrats responding to unusual reports. They were part of a coordinated effort that had been monitoring indigenous communities for decades, looking for exactly the kind of spiritual manifestations that Talina represented. There are people in government agencies who study unexplained phenomena, Talina said, repeating Dr. Hayes's earlier warning, but adding new details revealed by the crystal. They have files on our family going back to my great-great-grandmother. They've been waiting for someone like me to appear. The most disturbing vision showed laboratories equipped with sophisticated monitoring devices, holding cells designed to contain subjects with supernatural abilities, and research protocols that treated spiritual gifts as phenomena to be measured, catalogued, and potentially weaponized. Siku's collar, the shadow artifact that bound his power, began to materialize in the physical world as the visions continued. It appeared as a band of translucent darkness around his neck, inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The collar wasn't just a restraint, it was a test mechanism, created by the ancient spirits to ensure that bridgewalkers proved their worthiness before gaining access to their full abilities. The collar binds my power until the child demonstrates that she can use her gifts responsibly, Siku explained. But it also limits how much I can protect her during the trials ahead. She must face the final challenges with only her own strength and the wisdom of her ancestors. Sarah leaned forward, studying the spirit artifact with evident concern. What happens if she fails the test? The gifts fade away, Siku replied simply. She becomes an ordinary child, and the spiritual crisis continues until another Bridgewalker is born, which may not happen for several more generations. But the crystal showed them one more crucial piece of information. The approaching government forces weren't just interested in studying Talina. They had technology designed to suppress supernatural abilities, equipment that could disrupt the spiritual connections she'd been developing. If they captured her before her training was complete, her gifts might be permanently damaged. How long do we have? Joseph asked. Talina stared deeper into the crystal, her expression growing more urgent. Less time than we thought. They have helicopters flying search patterns now, and tracking equipment that can detect unusual electromagnetic signatures. The crystal itself is probably showing up on their instruments. As if responding to this information, the crystal of seeing began to pulse more rapidly, its light growing brighter and more complex. The ancestor beads around Talina's neck started resonating in harmony with the crystal, creating a feedback loop of spiritual energy that was beautiful but potentially dangerous. The awakening is accelerating beyond our control, Sarah observed with growing alarm. The child's gifts are responding to the approaching threat by developing faster than they should. This could burn her out before she learns to regulate the power properly. Siku's shadow collar grew more visible as his bound abilities strained against their constraints. The final trial must begin now, even though the child isn't fully prepared. The spirits have arranged events to force a crisis that will either complete her transformation or end it permanently. Joseph felt the weight of generations pressing against his chest as his medicine pouch grew warm. Everything his grandfather had prepared him for, all the traditional knowledge he'd carried without fully understanding its purpose, had led to this moment of ultimate choice. What does the final trial require? He asked. The crystal's visions shifted to show the most sacred site in their territory, a place called Anyu, the breathing place, where the boundary between physical and spirit worlds was thinnest. It was located at the summit of the highest peak in the surrounding mountains, accessible only by a treacherous climb that would test not just their physical endurance, but their spiritual resolve. She must make the choice alone, Siku said, his luminous eyes fixed on Talina. At Anyu, she will face the full weight of what it means to be a bridgewalker. She can accept the responsibility for maintaining balance between worlds, knowing it will mark her as different for the rest of her life. Or she can reject the gift, return to ordinary existence, and allow the spiritual crisis to continue. Talina looked up from the crystal of seeing, her pale green eyes now carrying depths of understanding that no 6-year-old should possess. And if I choose to become the bridge walker, then you become something more than human, but less than spirit, Sarah replied gently. You gain the ability to communicate between worlds, to heal the damage that's been done to the connection between your people and the land. But you also accept responsibility for maintaining that balance for the rest of your life and the lives of those who come after you. The sound of distant helicopter rotors carried across the valley, still miles away but approaching steadily. The government forces had found them. Joseph touched his medicine pouch one final time, feeling the weight of his ancestors' wisdom and the gravity of the choice his granddaughter would soon have to make. Talina's awakening had reached its crucial moment, and whatever happened next would determine not just her future, but the future of their people's relationship with the spiritual world. The shadow collar around Siku's neck pulsed with dark energy, waiting to be either removed through successful completion of the trials, or to bind the wolf spirit permanently if Talina failed to prove her worthiness. The final test was about to begin. The ascent to Anu began before dawn on their 5th day in Sivulik Valley, with the sound of approaching helicopters growing steadily stronger in the distance. Joseph's weathered hands trembled as he helped Talina prepare for the most dangerous climb of their journey, knowing that everything they'd worked toward would be decided on the sacred peak that rose nearly 3,000 feet above their current position. The binding circle that would contain and direct Talina's spiritual power during the final ceremony had to be created from materials gathered along their ascent route. Sarah had explained the requirements with the gravity of someone who understood that mistakes could have permanent consequences. 7 stones from different elevations, each one found at a location where the wind chimes had sung with particular intensity. Sacred herbs that grew only in specific microclimates on the mountain slopes. Water from a spring that emerged exactly halfway up the climbing route, where traditional stories said the earth's breath could be heard if one listened carefully. But most importantly, they needed what Sarah called heart blood, a willing offering of life, essence that would bind the circle to Talina's spiritual signature and allow her to safely channel the full power of her bridgewalker abilities. It doesn't mean she has to be injured, Sarah had explained to Joseph's worried expression. Heart blood refers to something given from the deepest part of her being, a sacrifice that proves her commitment to serving something greater than herself. Siku had transformed further during the night, his shadow collar becoming more visible as his bound power strained against its constraints. The wolf spirit now stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder, his silver coat rippling with ethereal light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Talina's heartbeat. But his luminous blue eyes carried a sadness that suggested he knew something about the approaching trials that he couldn't share. The collar prevents me from telling her what she'll face at Anu, he'd explained to Joseph during a quiet moment while Talina gathered the required herbs. The test must be undertaken without advanced knowledge of its challenges. I can guide her to the sacred site, but once the ceremony begins, she must rely on her own wisdom and the strength of her connection to the ancestors. The climb itself proved more treacherous than Joseph had anticipated. His 72-year-old body protested every step up the rocky slope, and he found himself relying heavily on both his walking stick and Sarah's surprisingly strong support. The old woman seemed to draw energy from the sacred mountain, moving with confidence across terrain that should have challenged someone half her age. As they ascended, the wind chimes that had guided their journey became more frequent and more complex. Each one appeared at crucial decision points along the climbing route, their bone pieces carved with increasingly intricate symbols that seemed to tell the story of their people's spiritual history. Talina would pause at each chime to listen to voices only she could hear, receiving guidance that helped her select the proper stones and herbs for the binding circle. It was during one of these listening sessions, about halfway up the mountain, that the most disturbing revelation occurred. Talina suddenly straightened from her communion with a particularly elaborate wind chime and turned to look back down the valley with an expression of profound sadness. They're at the village now, she said quietly. The government people. They have Mama and Papa. Joseph felt his heart stop. What do you mean they have them? Not arrested, Talina clarified, her pale green eyes reflecting knowledge that came from the crystal of seeing's distant visions. But they're being held for questioning about where we went. And there are scientists setting up equipment in our house, in Grandpa's backyard, where I used to practice my meditations. Sarah's expression grew grim. They're trying to measure the spiritual residue left by her training. Such interference could disrupt the connection between the child and her ancestors, making the final ceremony more dangerous. But worse news was yet to come. The approaching helicopter sounds had multiplied, suggesting that multiple aircraft were now converging on their location. More troubling was the electronic signature detection equipment Talina could sense. Through her enhanced awareness, technology, designed to track the unique electromagnetic patterns generated by supernatural abilities. They have machines that can find me anywhere now, she said with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to overwhelming circumstances. The crystal of seeing created too much spiritual energy. It's like a beacon, showing them exactly where we are. Siku's shadow collar pulsed with dark energy as his bound abilities fought against their constraints. The spirits anticipated this interference. The final trial was designed to be completed under pressure, when the choice between accepting or rejecting her destiny carries immediate consequences. As they continued climbing, Joseph noticed that the ancestor beads around Talina's neck were beginning to change. Each carved piece was growing warmer and starting to emit its own faint light, as if responding to their proximity to the sacred peak. The symbols on the beads seemed to shift and dance in his peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into patterns that suggested meaning just beyond his comprehension. The ancestors are preparing her for the final awakening, Sarah observed with satisfaction. Each bead carries the essence of a family member who possessed similar gifts. At Anu, their combined wisdom will either guide her through the transformation or help her understand why the gift should be rejected. The physical demands of the climb were taking their toll on Joseph, but he pushed forward with determination born of generational responsibility. His medicine pouch seemed to pulse with encouraging warmth, as if his grandfather's spirit was lending strength for the final ascent. But he could feel his heart laboring with the thin mountain air and the stress of knowing that government forces were closing in on their location. It was Tom Aknavigak's voice, carried on the wind from somewhere below them, that announced the arrival of their pursuers. "Joseph, Sarah, we know you're up there. The federal agents want to talk. They're not here to arrest anyone. They just want to understand what's happening with the girl." Joseph recognized the strain in his old friend's voice. Tom was clearly being used as an intermediary, probably under some form of duress, to convince them to surrender voluntarily rather than forcing a confrontation on the dangerous mountain slopes. "Should we answer?" Joseph asked Sarah quietly. "Not yet," the old woman replied. "Let them reveal their true intentions first." The answer came in the form of amplified voices from electronic speakers, official, bureaucratic tones that carried the unmistakable authority of federal agencies. "This is Dr. Patricia Morrison, Director of the Department of Anomalous Phenomena Research. We have authorization to take custody of the minor child for her own safety and the security interests of the United States government." Sarah spat in disgust. "They speak of safety while bringing weapons to a sacred mountain. They speak of security while disrupting spiritual ceremonies that have maintained balance for centuries." But it was the next announcement that revealed the true scope of what they were facing. "We have non-lethal suppression technology that can temporarily neutralize supernatural abilities. Compliance will ensure the child's gifts remain intact. Resistance may result in permanent damage to her developing abilities." Talina stopped climbing and looked back down the mountain with an expression that seemed far too old for her 6-year-old face. "They're not lying about the suppression technology. I can feel it in the helicopters. Machines that create interference patterns designed to disrupt spiritual connections. Joseph felt a surge of protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. They would risk damaging her permanently just to study her. They see her as a resource rather than a person, Siku replied, his luminous eyes reflecting ancient wisdom and modern sadness. Such people have always existed in every generation. The difference now is that they have technology that can cause damage the old healing. Methods cannot repair. The sound of boots on rock announced the arrival of the first ground team climbers who had been inserted by helicopter at various points around the mountain's base and were now ascending multiple routes simultaneously. Professional voices carried across the thin air, coordinating their approach with military precision. How much farther to Anu? Joseph asked. His breathing labored from the exertion and altitude. Less than an hour if we maintain this pace, Sarah replied. But the final approach requires spiritual preparation that cannot be rushed. Even under these circumstances, as if responding to her words, the wind chimes around them began singing with increased intensity, their bone pieces creating harmonies that seemed designed to mask the sounds of their movement from the searchers below. More remarkably, the chimes appeared to be coordinating their songs to create acoustic confusion, echoing and redirecting sounds in ways that made it difficult for the pursuit teams to pinpoint their exact location. The ancestors protect their own, Sarah murmured with satisfaction. But the most significant change was occurring in Talina herself. As they approached the sacred peak, her spiritual abilities were expanding beyond anything they'd witnessed before. She could now sense the intentions and emotional states of every person on the mountain, from the determined federal agents to Tom's conflicted worry about his old friend's safety. There are 12 people climbing toward us from different directions, she reported with the calm precision of someone reading a map. The government people are scared but determined. They really believe they're protecting me from something dangerous. But there are others with them, scientists who see me as a chance for career advancement, and military personnel who think spiritual gifts could be weaponized. The ancestor beads around her neck were now glowing brightly enough to be visible even in the daylight, and the symbols carved into their surfaces were shifting through patterns that seemed to tell stories about their family's spiritual heritage. Each bead pulsed with its own rhythm, creating a complex symphony of light and energy that grew stronger with each step toward the summit. Siku's transformation accelerated as they climbed higher, his shadow collar becoming more substantial and more restrictive. The wolf spirit was now clearly struggling against bonds that prevented him from using his full power to protect them. But his luminous eyes carried a message of encouragement that needed no words. The trial ahead would test Talina's worthiness, but she possessed the strength to succeed if she trusted in the wisdom of her ancestors. The final approach to Anu required climbing through a narrow pass between two towering rock formations, where the wind chimes hung so thickly that their songs created an almost impenetrable wall of sound. As they entered this sacred corridor, Joseph felt the weight of generations pressing against his chest more strongly than ever before. His granddaughter walked ahead of him with the confidence of someone following a familiar path, despite never having been to this place before. The ancestor beads guided her steps, their combined light creating a pathway through the treacherous terrain. Behind them, the pursuit teams were growing closer. But the spiritual energy radiating from Talina was beginning to affect their equipment in ways that would soon force a critical decision about how far they were willing to go to capture her. At the summit of Anu, the binding circle awaited, a sacred space where Talina would face the ultimate choice between accepting her destiny as the Bridgewalker or returning to ordinary existence. But with government forces closing in and suppression technology threatening to damage her gifts permanently, the traditional ceremony would have to be conducted under conditions that no Bridgewalker in history had ever faced. The ancestors' wisdom would either prove sufficient for this modern challenge, or their ancient protections would fail against technology and determination that respected no spiritual boundaries. The summit of Anu revealed itself as a circular plateau about 50 feet across, surrounded by standing stones that had been placed by human hands countless generations ago. At the center of this ancient ceremonial ground, a natural depression in the rock formed the perfect foundation for the binding circle that would contain and direct Talina's transformation. The wind here carried voices, not just the songs of the bone chimes that hung from every stone pillar, but the actual whispers of ancestral spirits who had been waiting decades for this moment. Sarah immediately began arranging the 7 stones they'd collected during their ascent, placing each one according to traditional patterns that followed the cardinal directions and the movements of celestial bodies. Joseph helped despite his exhaustion, his medicine pouch now radiating warmth so intense it seemed to burn against his chest. But it was Talina who completed the circle's construction, pouring the sacred spring water and connecting lines between the stones while speaking in the ceremonial Inupiaq that flowed from her lips like remembered song. As the binding circle took shape, something extraordinary began to happen. The accumulated spiritual energy from all their artifacts, the ancestor beads, the wind chimes, the talking stick Sarah still carried, and Joseph's medicine pouch started resonating together in perfect harmony. Light began emanating from the completed circle, not harsh like electric illumination, but soft and warm like moonlight filtering through crystal. But the most dramatic change occurred in Siku. As Talina stepped into the center of the binding circle, the wolf spirit's shadow collar began to crack. Dark energy leaked from the fractures like steam escaping from a pressure valve, and with each crack, more of Siku's true power became available. "The trial begins now," he announced in his otherworldly voice, his luminous blue eyes fixed on Talina with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into her soul. "You must choose not just whether to accept the gift of Bridge Walker, but whether you're willing to pay its full price." The price became clear as the binding circle's light intensified and began showing visions visible to all present. They could see the future that awaited Talina if she accepted her destiny, a life dedicated to maintaining balance between the physical and spirit worlds, marked forever as different from other people, carrying responsibilities that would affect not just her own community but indigenous peoples around the world who had lost connection with their traditional spiritual practices, but they could also see the cost of rejection. Without a bridge walker to restore balance, the spiritual crisis would worsen. Traditional knowledge would continue fading until it was lost completely. The connection between human consciousness and the natural world would weaken to the breaking point, leaving future generations spiritually impoverished and disconnected from the land that sustained them. "The choice must be made freely," Sarah said gently, though her weathered face showed the strain of watching a 6-year-old child contemplate decisions that would affect countless lives. "No one can tell you what to choose, little one. The ancestors can only show you the consequences of each path." From somewhere below them, on the mountain, came the sound of shouting voices and mechanical equipment. The government forces had reached the narrow pass leading to the summit and were ascending the final approach with determined urgency. Through enhanced awareness granted by the binding circle, Talina could sense their intentions with perfect clarity. "Dr. Morrison really believes she's protecting me," Talina said, with the calm wisdom that had become her normal speaking voice during spiritual communications. "She's lost children of her own and sees me as someone who needs saving from dangerous delusions. But the military people with her have different plans. They want to understand how spiritual gifts work so they can create artificial versions." The ancestor beads around her neck were now blazing with light, bright enough to illuminate the entire ceremonial ground. Each bead pulsed with the essence of a family member who had possessed similar gifts. And as their combined radiance grew stronger, Talina began to hear their voices directly, not as channeled communications, but as conversations with beloved relatives who offered guidance from beyond the physical world. Joseph watched in amazement as his granddaughter spoke with ancestors he remembered from his own childhood, their voices carrying across the years with messages of love, wisdom, and encouragement. But he also heard warnings about the challenges she would face if she accepted the Bridgewalker transformation: isolation from normal human relationships, constant responsibility for maintaining spiritual balance, and the knowledge that her choices would affect generations yet unborn. The sound of helicopters grew deafening as aircraft circled the summit, their downdrafts creating whirlwinds that should have disrupted the ceremony, but somehow left the binding circle's light undisturbed. Electronic interference from suppression technology created visible distortions in the air around the sacred site. But the ancestral protections held firm. Siku's collar cracked further, releasing more bound power with each fracture. As the wolf spirit's true nature continued revealing itself, he began to glow with silver radiance that complemented the golden light emanating from Talina's ancestor beads. The harmony between Spirit Guardian and Bridgewalker created a feedback loop of energy that made the entire summit pulse with otherworldly power. There at the base of the final climb, Talina announced, her enhanced awareness tracking the approaching ground teams. 5 minutes, maybe less, the moment of ultimate choice had arrived. Everything that had led them to this sacred mountain, Joseph's lifetime of carrying traditional knowledge, Sarah's patient preservation of ancient wisdom, and Talina's extraordinary awakening to her spiritual gifts, had prepared them for this single decision that would determine the future of their people's connection to the sacred world. The binding circle waited, its light ready to either complete her transformation into the Bridgewalker or safely return her to ordinary childhood, depending on her choice. Talina's decision came not as words but as action. She placed both hands on the ancestor beads around her neck and spoke a single phrase in ceremonial Inupiaq that Joseph recognized from his grandfather's most sacred rituals. I accept the responsibility of the ancestors and offer my life in service to the balance between worlds. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Light exploded from the binding circle in all directions, not harsh, but warm and encompassing, creating what appeared to be a bridge of pure spiritual energy that stretched between the physical realm and dimensions visible only to those with awakened sight. Through this bridge of light, the forms of countless ancestors became visible, generations of bridgewalkers who had maintained the balance before traditional knowledge faded from common practice. Siku's shadow collar shattered completely, releasing the full power of the wolf spirit in a burst of silver radiance that merged with the golden light of Talina's transformation. But instead of celebrating his freedom, the ancient guardian immediately focused his energy on protecting the ceremony from the interference of the approaching suppression technology. As government forces reached the summit's edge, they found themselves unable to advance further. The spiritual energy radiating from the binding circle created a barrier that their equipment couldn't penetrate or disrupt. Electronic devices failed, communication systems went silent, and the suppression technology designed to neutralize supernatural abilities simply ceased functioning in the presence of power that predated human understanding of such forces. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the federal team leader, stood at the barrier's edge with an expression of scientific amazement warring with bureaucratic frustration. "What are we looking at?" she demanded of her technical specialists. "Unknown. Energy patterns that don't conform to any established physics," came the reply from equipment operators whose instruments were registering readings beyond their measurement capacity. "Whatever's happening in that circle is generating power levels that should be impossible for a single individual to produce." But Joseph, watching from within the sacred space, understood what the government forces couldn't comprehend. Talina wasn't generating this power alone. She was channeling the accumulated spiritual energy of every ancestor who had ever possessed similar gifts, their combined wisdom and strength flowing through her as she underwent the final transformation that would make her a true Bridgewalker. The process was both beautiful and terrifying. Talina's physical form began to shimmer as the boundary between her human consciousness and the spirit realm grew thin. For moments, she appeared almost translucent, as if existing simultaneously in multiple dimensions. The ancestor beads around her neck had become so bright they looked like captured stars, each one pulsing with the heartbeat of a family member who offered their strength to help her complete the awakening. "What's happening to her?" Joseph asked Sarah, concern overriding his wonder at witnessing the most sacred ceremony of his people. "She's becoming what she was born to be," Sarah replied with tears streaming down her weathered face. "But the transformation is more powerful than any previous bridgewalker has experienced, because the spiritual crisis is deeper than it's ever been before." Through the Bridge of Light, they could see the extent of that crisis. Communities around the world where traditional knowledge had been lost, indigenous peoples disconnected from ancestral wisdom, and the growing void between human consciousness and the natural world that sustained all life. Talina's transformation was occurring at a moment when the need for spiritual healing had reached critical levels. As the ceremony reached its crescendo, something unexpected happened. The Harmony Stone began to emerge from the center of the binding circle, a crystalline formation that grew from the rock itself, spiraling upward in patterns that perfectly balanced the energies flowing through the sacred space. Unlike the crystal of seeing they'd used in the valley, this formation didn't show visions of past or future, but rather created perfect equilibrium between all the spiritual forces present. The Harmony Stone's appearance marked the completion of Talina's transformation. The child who stepped out of the binding circle was recognizably the same 6-year-old who had entered it, but her pale green eyes now held depths of understanding that encompassed both human and spiritual perspectives. She moved with the confident grace of someone who had found perfect balance between two worlds. Government forces watched in amazement as the barrier around the sacred site dissolved, their equipment coming back online, but registering normal readings despite the extraordinary events they'd just witnessed. To their instruments, nothing unusual had occurred. A limitation of technology that could measure energy but not wisdom, power but not transformation. Dr. Morrison approached cautiously, her scientific training struggling to process what she'd observed. "Are you all right, child?" Talina smiled with the serene confidence of someone who had found her true purpose. "I'm exactly what I was meant to be, and I think you'll find that your equipment can no longer detect anything unusual about me." She was correct. The suppression technology that had threatened to damage her, developing abilities now registered her spiritual gifts as completely integrated with her. Normal human consciousness, no longer supernatural, phenomena that could be disrupted, but natural abilities that existed in perfect harmony with her physical form. Siku, now free of his binding collar but choosing to remain as her guardian and companion, approached with the satisfied bearing of a duty completed. The wolf spirit had tested Talina's worthiness and found her ready to carry the responsibility of maintaining balance between worlds. The Bridgewalker had awakened, and the spiritual crisis that had threatened her people's connection to the sacred world was beginning to heal. 6 months had passed since that transformative dawn on Anu's sacred summit, and the changes rippled far beyond what Joseph had ever imagined possible when he first watched his granddaughter choose the unusual white pup at the sled dog breeder's camp. Now, as autumn painted the tundra in brilliant oranges and reds, he sat in his backyard watching Talina conduct what had become a daily gathering of remarkable scope and significance. The legacy scroll had appeared 3 weeks after their return from the mountain, a living document that seemed to write itself, recording not just the events of Talina's awakening, but the ongoing restoration of traditional knowledge throughout their community and beyond. Made from what appeared to be traditional hide, but possessed of qualities that defied normal understanding, the scroll continued growing longer as more communities learned of the Bridgewalker's emergence and began rediscovering their own spiritual connections. Talina herself had grown into her role with the natural confidence of someone living according to her true purpose. She still looked like the same 6-year-old child who had knelt beside a pale-eyed creature in the shadows, but her presence now carried an authority that even adults recognized and respected. When she spoke about traditional ways or spiritual matters, her words carried the weight of ancestral wisdom. Yet she retained the curiosity and joy that belonged to childhood. The daily gatherings had started small, just a few village children who were drawn by stories of her remarkable abilities. But word had spread through networks of indigenous communities across Alaska and beyond, bringing families from distant villages who sought guidance in reconnecting with cultural practices that had been dormant for generations. This morning's gathering was particularly significant. Representatives from 12 different native communities had arrived in Kivalina over the past week, each bringing children who showed signs of spiritual gifts that had been dismissed or misunderstood until news of Talina's awakening reached their elders. Joseph watched with pride and amazement as his granddaughter moved among the visiting children with Siku at her side. The wolf spirit, now clearly visible in his true form to anyone with spiritual awareness. She would place her hands on the legacy scroll and somehow draw from its ever-expanding record the specific traditional knowledge each community needed to nurture their own emerging bridge walkers. She's teaching them faster than should be possible, Sarah observed from her seat beside Joseph. The old woman had become Talina's primary mentor in the traditional ways. But even she was amazed by how quickly the child could transfer complex spiritual understanding to others. It's not just teaching, Joseph replied. Watching Talina help a young boy from Point Hope understand why ravens gathered whenever he played outside. She's awakening knowledge that was already present but sleeping. The ancestors invested their wisdom in all our bloodlines, waiting for someone who could help others remember. The transformation extended beyond individual children to entire communities. Families who had struggled to maintain connection with traditional ways found themselves naturally returning to practices their grandparents had known. Elders who thought they'd forgotten ancient languages discovered words flowing back to them with startling clarity. Traditional crafts, ceremonies, and healing methods were being restored as if the knowledge had never truly been lost. Dr. Patricia Morrison had become an unexpected ally in this process. The federal official who had initially sought to study Talina as an anomalous phenomenon had undergone her own transformation after witnessing the ceremony on Anu. She now worked to establish protective protocols that prevented other government agencies from interfering with indigenous spiritual practices, recognizing that such phenomena were beyond the scope of scientific analysis and deserved the same protections as other religious freedoms. The child has taught us that some mysteries are more valuable when honored rather than explained. Dr. Morrison had written in her official report, federal agencies would better serve the public interest by protecting these cultural treasures rather than attempting to catalogue them. David and Elena had struggled initially with their daughter's extraordinary destiny, but they'd found their own roles in supporting her mission. David had taken a position with the state government specifically focused on protecting indigenous cultural sites from commercial development, while Elena had become an advocate for traditional knowledge preservation in educational systems. We realized that trying to give her a normal childhood was missing the point. Elena had explained during a recent family dinner, normal for Talina means helping other families reconnect with traditions that were almost lost. That's not a burden. It's a gift she was born to share. The most remarkable change was in the spiritual health of their community itself. The division between believers and skeptics that had marked the early days of Talina's awakening had dissolved into a shared appreciation for the renewed connection with traditional ways. Even those who didn't fully understand the spiritual aspects of her gifts could see the positive effects on their children and their community's sense of identity. Tomac Navigak summed up the transformation during a recent community meeting. We've remembered who we really are, not just the modern people living in this place, but the descendants of those who understood how to live in harmony with the land and the spirits that inhabit it. As Joseph watched the afternoon's teaching session conclude, with visiting children returning to their families, carrying new understanding of their own spiritual heritage, he felt the weight of generations finally lifting from his shoulders. His medicine pouch, which had grown heavier with each passing year as he carried accumulated wisdom without understanding its purpose, now felt comfortable against his chest, its contents finally being used as his grandfather had intended. Talina approached him as the last of the visiting families departed, Siku padding beside her with the satisfied bearing of a guardian whose charge was thriving. She still wore the ancestor beads, but they no longer blazed with urgent spiritual energy. Instead, they pulsed gently with the steady rhythm of balanced power being used in service to others. "Grandpa," she said, settling beside him on the old wooden bench where he'd first struggled to understand her unusual connection with the white pup. "The legacy scroll shows me that other bridge walkers are awakening in communities around the world. Indigenous peoples everywhere are starting to remember the old agreements with the spiritual realm." Joseph nodded, understanding that his granddaughter's transformation had been part of something much larger than their family's story. "And what does that mean for you?" Talina smiled with the serene confidence that had become her normal expression since completing the trials on Anu. "It means I get to keep learning and teaching and helping families find their way back to traditions that never really left. They were just waiting for someone to show the path home." As the Arctic evening painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Joseph reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple visit to a dog breeder and led to the restoration of spiritual connections that had been dormant for generations. The legacy scroll would continue recording these developments, ensuring that the knowledge would be preserved for future generations who might need guidance in maintaining the balance between traditional wisdom and modern life. The bridge walker had found her purpose, and through her, the ancient agreements between human consciousness and the spiritual realm were being renewed for a new age.